It's all
4 days a week. Anyway, I'm an engineer by background. University of Oklahoma. Worked a lot of different places for years. Really, for the last 25 years, I've really worked mostly CO2 floods. Also an MBA from the University of Texas as well. But anyway, I'm really an engineer by training. So most of what you're hearing today is really just an update on what we've done at North Burbank since we've operated it. Give you a little about who we are. We are a little bit different type of an oil company. We'll talk more about that. Probably the new stuff we're going to talk about is this 45Q CO2 tax credits that I don't think I've ever talked about. At least I know I haven't talked about it here. So Perdure, again, we were formed in 2017. We basically bought all of Chaparral's EOR assets in their company. So it's really Burbank Field, and then we own 6 floods out in the Panhandle as well. The other units we operate, we've made an acquisition earlier this year, so we actually operate some CO2 floods in the Permian as well. I know it sounds like we're a CO2 ER company, but we're really not. We just look for good opportunities to make investments. But right now, everything is CO2 ER. Where I say we're different, we may not be as different as we were a year ago or 2 years ago, is we only spend cash flow. So we're not out raising money every year trying to outspend our cash flow. We're not raising debt, not selling equity. We basically have to pay a distribution every year, and we can spend what's left over. So our operations are very cash flow based. We have a lot of people like myself and others in the country who have done a lot of CO2 activities. And it's really across the spectrum. If you just do a CO2 flood, that's really only about one aspect of it. You got to source the CO2, you got to get it there. Now you have the CO2 sequestration that's come along as well. That could actually boost CO2 enhanced oil recovery throughout the nation. But we'll see how that actually happens. And then, what's a couple of our guys that have even been in the business of selling CO2? Right now, there's probably about a little under 1.6 BCF, cubic feet a day of CO2 used in EOR, and most of that's from natural sources. So there is a market for buying and selling CO2 to other EOR operators. We don't currently do that. We only sell CO2 to people that have interest in the same fields we do. So here's where, Osage County, North Burbank unit, huge field. Our CO2 comes from the source. We have there, Coffeyville, Kansas. That's about 74, 75 miles away. That's actually a fertilizer plant. So this is, by definition, anthropogenic, the fancy word for man-made CO2. We take that CO2, we take it down to Burbank, and we flood with it. You can see the circle there is where we actually are CO2 flooding today. It might be a little bigger than that. I didn't think this slide from last year, but it won't be much bigger than that. So we have a long way to go. We're currently probably flooding less than 20-25% of the entire unit. Obviously, we have a couple other units in the area as well. That's an 8-inch CO2 pipeline. Our CO2 source is limited at 50 million a day, or whatever Coffeyville actually produces, but they don't ever produce more than 50. So with a field this size, we'll be CO2 flooding long after most of us are gone in this room out here. It's just going to take a long time to flood this year. I have a background, used to work for a company called Denbury, you might be familiar with. We had a large natural source of CO2. If we own this field, if Denbury owned this field and it was in the Gulf Coast, near their CO2 supply, they'd probably be putting over 200 million cubic feet of CO2 in this reservoir versus what we're doing. Just to put it in perspective, it's going to be a slog, but it'll be continuous. Reserves in the field, this is the whole company, but no, this is just Kate County. About 72 million barrels recoverable from CO2 EOR. Obviously it's all oil. Any gas we produce is actually contaminated by the CO2, so there's no gas sales out here at all. You hear a lot of people talk about BOEs. We're not BOEs, we're actually barrels. So this is truly oil reserves. No natural gas liquids, no condensate, it's strictly oil. For those of you who may not be familiar with the field, it really produces from 2 different sands. They are in vertical communication with each other. You have a very permeable red fork sand sits on top, less permeable Barnesville sand that sits on the bottom. We call it the Burbank sand. We flood them simultaneously, but obviously with the differences in permeability, CO2 reacts quicker in the Red Fork than it does in Barnesville. About 824 million barrels are flowing through the place, so just under 1 billion barrels in the field, in the unitized area. Actually, if you looked at the greater Burbank or Burbank area, it probably approaches 1 billion barrels. The laws include Cape County and some of the South Burbank County, probably closer to 1 billion barrels. It's relatively shallow for CO2 flooding, it's about 3,100 feet. Fuel was found in the 20s, and it's been developed over many, many years. There's been many, many stages of different types of operations out here. Probably every form of EOR other than steam. I don't think I've seen any steam floods out here. Steam was done? Okay. Every part of EOR has been done. But it's been done out here. We operate the reservoir at 1,650 pounds. Fluctuates probably 50 psi depending on the day, the month, and how much CO2 is coming from Coffeyville. And if you do the calculation, that's slightly above hydrostatic. That's in order to achieve what we call miscibility with CO2, which is basically the definition of miscibility is you can't tell what the relative concentrations of the So you can't tell when we have 1% CO2, 99% oil, 99% CO2, 1% oil. There's a large number of P&A wells out here. We'll talk about that a little bit. There's been over 3,200 wells drilled in the unit. We only have about 500 that are currently active. You can see the size of it. That's including this one. 7,000. The unit itself is about 23,400 and something acres. Talk a little about the history. We talked most about this. You can see it's gone through multiple stages. CO2 flooding started in 2013. That was started by a company called Chaparral. Today, there are 74 WAC patterns. We took over 2 years ago. There were just under 50 WAC patterns. So in our 2 years, we've almost added 50%. We are taking plus or minus 40 flat feet a day of new CO2 coming in every day. We also recycle about 60. So we're moving a little over 100 million barrels of CO2 every day. Oil production is now about 3,000 barrels a day. And most of that is from that 20-25% that's under CO2. You see the dip there. We had some mechanical issues on some wells. We had to take care of after we took over. I think we resolved all that. Production's come back up. Last year, we were probably about the dip area there when I spoke. It might have been coming back, but it was pretty low. So again, if you remember that first map, this is the CO2 flood area. The pink right now is what's under CO2 flood. Now there could be water going in some of those because we do lag here on a pretty scheduled basis. The darker green is where we are adding patterns this year. So the hatched ones we've added already. So we've added 5 patterns this year. The other 3 will be added by the end of the year. Still have a little bit of work to do to secure in the lighter green area. We've got work to do there. As soon as we finish that work, we'll turn those other 3 patterns on. And it's kind of the way we do it. We're always about two lines, you can say 2 phases ahead. The brown phase, we actually did most of that work last year. And that work, that's on water right now, kind of a water curtain. Blue is the water curtain. We keep the water curtain around this. The permeability is so high that if you didn't contain it, CO2 would just run. We have to maintain the pressure in order to produce the maximum amount of oil. There's just the geology. I mean, you can see the sand. It's beautiful. It runs all over the place. It is basically a stratigraphic tract. Pitch out up to I'll call that to the east, northeast. There's that stringer sand that comes out of there that we don't operate. Another company operates that. And we don't have anything to do with that. As you can see, it's a big sand. As you move west, you do eventually go down and hit a water contact in the reservoir as well. But we're flooding basically simultaneous that Burbank sand. Mississippi has produced out here, isolated. That's really the only two formations that we really produced any significant oil. If you look at 19, this kind of gets more advancement rate. How much we spend? We're going to spend about $19 million or $16 million out here. That's just well work. That doesn't include CO2 purchases. If we include CO2 purchases, we probably add about another 75% to that number. A lot of the effort that we do is P&A or replugging wells in order to make sure we keep the CO2 in the ground. I think now, we did this, updated this slide last week, we were 36, but I think we're up to probably 40 this week. Due to some of the permitting issues that everybody's aware of here, it took us, we submitted most of our permits last fall, and we just really got most of them by this summer. So we really didn't get to do all our work the first half of the year. As we continue to develop the flood, CO2 recycler will continue to rise. So we've ordered a compressor that we'll have installed next year to bring our recycle up from about 65, 66 being today up to probably close to 85 or 86. And the other thing we've done a lot of work on this year is really lowered our gathering system pressure out here. One of the unique things to CO2 flooding that Burbank has, and probably the only other company that has it is Canada, very honestly, is all these wells flow. There is no pumping units in the CO2 flood area. I mean, obviously some of the old areas still have some pumping units and ESPs, but this flows. And so we're right on the ragged edge, and whether this will flow or not. And so if you lose any pressure at all, the wells will stop flowing. I mean, we just have wells that go along, we lose 25, 50 pounds of reservoir pressure, and they quit flowing. We were able to lower the gathering system pressure out here by about 50 pounds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot when you're talking about 5 or 10 or 15 pounds between producing or not producing. So we've got some more work like that to do as we continue to work through here and kind of manage the field more efficiently. So if you look at 20, it's going to be about the same. One of the differences, we have some future phases out here as well. You see kind of what the progression would be, but really that yellow area is what we're looking at. And part of that is the prior operator had basically a 2-pattern water recursion, but they also produced the water curtain. So you really kind of had I'm going to call it a pseudo curtain, because anytime the purpose of the water curtain is to create a pressure that nothing can cross. Well, when you're producing in between that curtain, things can cross. So we're going to convert the west side to a single water curtain and develop those yellow patterns, which they're great reservoir quality there. And if you didn't do it, then you just lose those reserves forever. So that's where we're going to spend most of the money next year. The other thing we're doing is moving about 3,400, 3,500 barrels a day. We expect to be approaching over 4,000 sometime next year. That's a lot of oil to truck. So we are going to we have an agreement with the oil purchaser out here to install a pipeline that will connect our two CO2 flood batteries. So we're going to minimize and reduce the number of trucks that are running around the roads out here quite a bit. It's only about a 2-mile line, and we're going to get that done. And still, you can see every year we have plenty of wells that we're going to have to P&A or re-P&A. A number of wells out here we're plugged with only mud or limited cement, and with the pressures we're dealing with, we just have to ensure that those wells don't help leak at all. We spend a lot of money on that as well. This just kind of gives you some graphs, just a little bit more than that little picture I had earlier. Not really anything exciting about these. I mean, it's going to slowly go up as we develop, but when you have 74 patterns and you're going to add 5 or 6, you're not going to see drastic increases in production here. The top is the entire district, so that includes Kidd County. The bottom graph is the North Burbank unit, which includes the CO2 flood and the water flood area combined. We not put in, I guess we don't have the CO2 flood area. This is the CO2 purchases that are going on. You can see back in 2018 we were having some issues with some leaking wells. We basically were purchasing nothing, And you can see now we're back averaging more close to that 45 million a day. The red is total CO2 handling. It goes up and down depending on recycling. We do have a compressor issue now that's limiting our ability to recycle. We'll get that to you. So what's the future? The future is continuing to develop the CO2 flood as we go. Again, with 50 million a day, we're taking 45 now. You just can't have that many patterns. This is very fast reservoir, so you can cycle some CO2, but it's really going to be 5 to 8, 10 patterns a year. These are basically 20-acre patterns, so you're adding 160 to 200 acres a year, and you've got 15,000+ acres to go. So it's going to take a while. Yeah. But one of the benefits of what we're doing out here is, anybody ever heard of 45Q tax credits? Yeah. Basically, they were passed originally in 2007, but they really weren't usable. And it's part of the climate movement. I'll give you that. But it's basically being able to take CO2 and sequester it in the ground versus venting it. Now you're going to go, wait a minute, Tracy, you're not doing that. Well, that's true. We are CO2 flooding, and that's our main goal. But the CO2 source we have is a man-made source. If we didn't take it and use it as a tertiary injectant, it would be vented. So with the new law that got passed in February of 2018, they made it pretty attractive to go ahead and claim these 45Q tax credits. And what that allows us to do is really effectively lower our CO2 costs at the end of the day. CO2 is pretty expensive. We're taking CO2 from atmospheric conditions, compressing it up, moving it 74 miles. That all costs, quite a bit of money. So what we're trying to do now is qualify for this, qualify Burbank. There's a lot of steps that you have to go through. You have to work with the EPA to get what's called a monitoring, reporting, and verification plan. But this really is something they now want. I think we will be able to get this done. The final rules will come out and probably by year end. At least rules we can rely on will get out by year end, whether they're final rules or not. And this could allow us to go faster. I mean, this is actually, it's a tax credit. So obviously you've got to have income in order to take advantage of the tax credit. We can always sell these too. So when we look at our pace of development, if we can qualify, sell the tax credits, that could give us extra dollars to advance the flood. But again, we're still limited by 50 million a day. Nothing's going to change that. The other upsides out here are infrastructure. We talked about the oil line. That's going to help. The other thing we're going to do out here is put in a blend line. Right now, we have purchased CO2 coming in the south part of the field, and we have hot gas coming from the recycle coming in the north. And unfortunately, it basically creates a barrier that they can't cross each other. So we're going to lay a line that eliminates that. It causes both CO2 streams to mix. So we'll have one pressure, one temperature regime in the field. And that will make our lives and the field guys' lives a whole lot easier. Our biggest issue out here is lead time on permits. I know you all know that. I'm not going to talk much about it. But in my opinion, it's a planning exercise. If I know I can get one in X days, that just means I have to start that many days ahead of time. We've tried that. It's becoming harder and harder because we just submit them and it seems to take a long time. But we continue to work on that as well. Probably the biggest ones that impact us more than anything are MIT failures. Because once, again, remember, go back to all these wells flow. We quit injecting CO2 in a pattern, pressure falls, production falls off fairly quickly. And it's taken us 4 to 6 months to be able to get permits to squeeze cement, which is fairly routine operation that most of us know about, but it is kind of challenging when the CO2 flow, you have to wait that long just to get a squeeze permit. I talked about everything flows. We are going to evaluate the use of artificial lift in the CO2 area. Again, it's just to see in some of these outer edges where You have higher pressure drops to get from the well all the way to the battery. And we have some flow lines that are 1.5 miles long, maybe 2 miles. That's a lot of pressure drop. So we are looking at whether or not it makes sense to put artificial lift out there in order just to maintain production versus having these wells come on and go off. And in the future, you know, what can we do for this other acreage? I mean, it's going to be years before we get CO2 to it. So we continue to look at other potential operations out here in terms of being able to produce oil. I mean, everything out here is going to be tertiary. You know, the water flooding is done, most of the secondary is done. So there's still a lot of well. We just got to figure out what the most efficient way to develop it's going to be. I probably talked a lot about that already. The Burbank does qualify. Some of the things that make it qualify is just the fact that we're injecting enough CO2. It's a pre-existing plant. Most of the rules are for new plants. We're not a new plant. But 500,000 tons, to put that in perspective for most of these, that's 25 million cubic feet a day. So we're injecting 45. We got plenty of cushion there. The other thing we could do potentially is accelerate our plan, or there is a possibility that we actually could use some of the CO2 that's saving off for injection. That's a lot longer story, but you actually can get credit for injecting CO2 into a water zone as well. Obviously, we're a CO2 floodder. We're going to use every molecule of CO2 that we can put in the ground for oil production first, but that is available out there for that as well. Challenges, these plugged and abandoned wells continue to cause issues. There's a lot of them. Actually, as we move south, there's fewer of them. But we're currently active, I think, in the current CO2 area. We counted close to 800 wells we're drilling. And there's a lot of plugged wells. And they're plugged in various different forms, plugged from 1920s to the 80s. So they're all plugged in different ways. There's no casing in most of these wells. And so if one leaks, which you have to rig up on, it's just a hole in the ground, which makes it that much more challenging. So, you know, we continue to work on that, trying to figure out the best way. We've redone our risk profile. We're going to work on 60 of those wells this year. Hopefully doing quite that many. A little bit of that was catch up. Talk about the finite lives of CO2 supply. I talked about the finite. And then just, you know, one of the issues we face every day is, you know, what do we do with that southern 80%, 75% of the field? I mean, it will produce, but there's a lot of old infrastructure, a lot of old pipe. You know, we manage the leaks as best we can, but it definitely doesn't justify you putting all this new infrastructure in. So we just have to manage that the best we can. We have replaced several flow lines out there where it makes economic sense. We're not opposed to it, but we do think it has to make economic sense. But given the time frame between now and when we can get some of those areas, it becomes a bigger and bigger challenge for us. I'm going to open up for questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a few questions. The first one, and maybe I missed it, and I understand what it is, but what does WAG stand for?
Water alternating gas. So you inject a certain volume of CO2, and you follow it with typically a light volume of water. The only thing that recovers the oil, let me step back. The way CO2 works is the oil we're going after is physically attached to the rock. I could pump zillions of volumes of water from there, it's never going to produce that oil. CO2 goes in there and it mixes with that oil, causing it to come off the rock. So it's really a solid
water push.
Yeah, so once we got it released, then we can push it with water.
All right, then is there a price per barrel that you all have, I'm sure you do, have in mind at what point would you have to shut down or really scale back significantly? What dollar range would the price of oil have to fall to for you all to significantly?
There's really two numbers.
Okay.
There's a number to advance, to continue to add patterns, and then if you just wanted to just maintain, that's a different number. But it's probably $40 maybe for just maintaining, and it's probably 50 to 55.
So you don't see that being as a near-term threat at this point?
No, the advancement probably is more threatening than the just maintaining what you have.
Okay, just two more quick questions. You get your source of CO2 from the fertilizer plant.
Right.
They make us assume most of their profit from selling the fertilizer.
Sure.
And then the CO2 is a byproduct that they're recovering some extra income from. Is the fertilizer market, surely you follow that a little bit because that's your lifeblood source of the CO2. Is the fertilizer market saturated? I guess what I'm asking is there any plans for the Coffeyville fertilizer plant to increase their operation that might give you a little more CO2?
No, they're really land bound there. That area, they can't expand. No.
Last question.
I want to answer your first question about the fertilizer market. The interesting thing about this is you have the Coffeyville refinery. This is an oil refinery. Now, they buy our oil at the current point. Now, trust me, we're not very much of that volume. But they actually use petcoke, which is the remains from the refinery. And they actually use the petcoke in the fertilizer plant. So it's a symbiotic plant, so it's not the same thing as the other fertilizer plants that are relying on natural gas prices. Because they actually are getting basically free feed because it comes from oil. Anyway.
All right, final question. You had mentioned that the Burbank field consists of the Red Fork, real permeable sandstone, and the Barlow field. You said they're vertically communicated. Is that situation throughout the whole field, even the other 80%? Does that occur
No, it varies.
throughout the whole field?
Now, Red Fork's more than more. So, I mean, that's why the CO2 flood started there to get a quick response. And as you move south, you get less and less rain.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Is this wind farm going to affect your operation?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I know it's out there, and I know there's been discussions over it, but it's not like we get power from it or anything, so. I don't think
It won't hinder your operation.
No, actually, most of the wind farms are actually outside of our.
If it started going toward your operation.
No, I mean, actually one of our floods up in the Panhandle has a wind farm on top of it.
Okay.
I mean, obviously they got to watch out for the pipelines when they drill piers for their.
So you can manage your operation?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I got another question. Where's all this extra CO2? You're pumping in, what, 45% coming in? Where's all that going?
Well, we have 76 patterns, 74 patterns, and so half of them, well, not exactly half, but for the simple reason, usually half are on CO2 and half are on water. So there's 30 some odd patterns that are on CO2 and the others are on water for the buying cycles. So, and then ultimately, you've got to keep expanding in order to.
Is it staying underground? Is it?
Oh, yeah, well, kind of. I mean, the way it works is it goes in, we inject it, right? It mixes with that oil. Since it's miscible, it comes back with the oil.
Right.
So we drop the pressure when it comes to the surface, and the CO2 comes out, because now it's a gas, and then we capture the recycle, and we re-inject it. That's what I'm saying. We're really injecting 105 million a day of CO2 every day. It's just 45 of it's quote new, 65 of it coming back.
So I think it was a totally contained situation.
It is. I
You
mean,
would not be pumping in 45% of
no, because
unless it's a placeholder down there.
well, there's a requirement called net utilization rate. We have to inject about 5 or 6 MCF, maybe 7, to produce that barrel. And then you have what's called a gross utilization rate, which is the number of times it kind of cycles around. That's closer to 15 or 16. So it's never really trapped there till you say, I'm done. We do lose some. I mean, some goes in unconnected pore space. It goes in pore space. Just can't make it back to the producer. I mean, some of that is permanently stored. But really in a CO2 flood, especially in this kind of permeability, my assumption is it's going around and around. And that's why we have to keep advancing. Because eventually, you're right, we wouldn't need any more purchased CO2. At all. Hold on.
Question, you're actually producing free CO2 out of producing wells, so you actually have a form of gas lift going on in your production wells?
Well, the CO2 is actually mixed with the oil when it hits the well field. Since we're flowing some depth as it's coming up.
It is lightening the column.
It does lighten the column some. But CO2 is pretty heavy.
That's a precursor to my next question.
Yeah.
I recall, I think, back when Chaparral was putting this in, that they did modeling studies at the University of Texas A&M, I think where it was. And I remember looking at that data, and they showed substantially increased recovery for gas alternating with polymer containing water. And have you considered anything like that, or would that actually kill, because of not having so much free gas and stuff in the reservoir, would that kill that as a recovery technique? So polymer alternating with gas.
No, you can pump the polymer, but all the polymer is going to do is thicken up the water.
It's going to do more than that.
Well, yeah, you can plug something up, but this is pretty early flood, Mike, so we're not ready to plug.
It doesn't have to plug it up.
But you're going to do one of two things. You're going to thicken the water, or it's going to flow. I mean, you could say it's going to reduce.
There's a residual.
Yeah, I agree, but that's way more surfactants than it is polymers. Okay, we'll disagree. But
You're CO2 expert, I'm a polymer expert.
I know polymers too. But I'm just telling you, I mean, those are the kind of the two reasons. You're right. But CO2 flooding, if you contact that oil, it's moving. There's not going to be anything left for a polymer if the CO2 contacts it. I mean,
Polymer is for sweep efficiency, nothing else.
Exactly, it's going to thicken. That's what I'm telling you. That's what I'm saying. So it could, but when you look at the mobility of CO2 oil, it is low. It doesn't take much. The water should be as efficient as the polymer. But that's a pretty tough one.
Why would the model show significantly increased recovery?
I think if you look at the original polymer flood study out there, it was really
I was there. I did.
I know. It was to plug up the high perm channels. And I think it could be at some point in the life of this flood. I think you're right. But we're in the early part of this CO2 flood. I think that's probably a later life thing. Because we've looked at it in other floods too.
We actually did polymer. The raft,
Which one?
Tracey.
Yeah.
Tracey.
No, that's right.
We did polymer first there, we also did immiscible flood
Yeah.
in Arkansas, and actually were able to have the floods in both cases, but that may have been very hard into the life of the floods. I don't really recall.
Right. Most of them have.
Because they had serious channeling problems.
Right.
That's why we did.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I agree. We are looking at it.
And I'm not arguing with you.
I know you're not. I got it. Let's see.
Tracy, what was the original reservoir pressure here when this CO2 injection was started?
1,300.
Yeah.
I mean, it was under original reservoir pressure, but it definitely went higher.
Follow-up question then is, can you do CO2 flooding in a reservoir that has had no pressure maintenance?
You can. I mean, like I said, if CO2 contacts oil, it's going to move it. Now, if you're in that truly immiscible state, i.e. you're below miscibility pressure, the recoveries will be low. Now, if you get, based on our experience at Denbury, we believe that if you got to about, I'm just going to say plus or minus 90% of miscibility pressure, you could be just as effective as miscibility. But you wouldn't want to do one at 300 pounds. And the biggest reason is the CO2 then is a gas, not a dense phase fluid. And so it just flies through the reservoir just like nitrogen or something else would do.
So the CO2 front began to hit about the time the regulatory environment started unwinding. And we had gone from, in Osage, like a permit would take 2 to 3 weeks to get turned around to upwards of a year now. What, if you're projected to see production grow to 4,000 barrels in the next year, and I understand you're drilling on cash flow, which is unusual in business today, but if that were to constrict, and you could deploy more capital in a more what we'd actually call a more normal regulatory environment here, what could the production grow to if you were waiting a month for a permit instead of a year?
Not much different because we're capped by that 50 million a day. So even if we would have got all of our permits in January, 3 months, 3 weeks, whatever.
So it's a supply.
It really is a supply issue here. So we have to get these started, and then they have to start producing CO2 ready for us to go to the next ones.
So the ability to expand CO2 to other, the Highway 60 trend or Dog Creek is limited because you in effect take all that they can deliver.
Right, and we will, in our model, that 72 million barrels, I think we finished the last phase in 2046.
Okay.
And that's basically taking the 50 million a day the entire time. Yes, sir.
Have you seen any negative and/or positive effects on neighboring operators?
We've seen some where some CO2 leaks. I think that's because of the water curve we have, so that's one reason why we're doing the other thing. Typically, there's positive and negative. Typically, it's very positive up front because they make more oil because it's mobilizing oil. Of course, then they're not equipped to handle, CO2-laden fluids, which are corrosive. So it starts out generally positive, and then it kind of goes negative. But we do our best to make sure we can take as much as we can. I mean, obviously, we're paying for it. And if it gets off our lease and somebody else produces it, it's going back in the air. They're not going to capture it. Okay. Go ahead.
Are you operating the same acreage as Chaparral?
Yeah, no, the unit's the unit.
Okay.
Yeah, you're never going to change that unit size, so no,
You're going to creep along.
we'll just creep along as we can. The CO2 supplies allow.
You guys have the South Burbank also?
We do.
It showed there. So you have to turn in water flow reports and all that stuff. What kind of reports do they require you to turn in on the CO2? Is the EPA requiring anything? Is there any type of injection volumes, or are they
Yeah,
just
there's-
like to do
right
a
now-
status report?
Right now, under, and I'm going to get the alphabet wrong, trust me, because there's about 4 different regulatory regimes how you have to report CO2. But as an EOR operator, not doing anything for sequestration, we report under, I think it's called UU. So we just have to report the volumes of CO2 that we inject every year to the EPA under the greenhouse gas emissions. If we go to 45Q, then I think we go under RR, and there we'll have to file injections, any losses. There's a lot more part of that MDR plan we have.
So all you're having to report to the BIA is a lease status report every 6 months? I mean, it's not considered a water flood, so you're not doing, you saw the water flood reports, didn't you, that came up during purchase?
I saw them all the time ago, yeah.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I know we report production every month.
Yeah, just production, but I mean, on well test, any volumes, any things like that.
Oh, no.
Because normally that's the only thing where you have to go by. Oh, that's it. So they still don't distinguish between primary oil, secondary oil, and tertiary oil. All of a sudden, they just drop all that information. So nobody has a clue unless you have a map that they don't provide. What other production?
Okay, I forgot to do the map.
What else are producing?
I'm not that familiar with the CO2 operation, but it's a tertiary operation following the water flood. Went on for decades. Is CO2 ever used as a secondary recovery method? In other words, coming after your primary production and then just going straight to CO2 flooding? and skipping the water plumbing?
Yeah, it's been done.
Pretty, has that proven to be
Very effective.
very effective?
Very effective. We, back to Denbury, we had Shell did. Shell found a small field in Mississippi about the time they were building their CO2 pipeline. And they could tell it was pressure depletion. They put it on CO2 probably within 18 months.
Oh, so you could actually
Oh, yeah.
initiate it
Oh, yeah.
during your primary.
Yeah, you could.
And
And that field recovered 85% of the water. Now, they over-drilled it, but that just shows you the effectiveness of CO2.
okay.
Because in cores, 6 inches by 2 inch core, you can get 100% of the water.
Is there any other gas similar to CO2?
Yeah.
That could be used as a substitute?
There are,
What would be the next best one?
well, actually, the best one is called hydrogen sulfide. Well, it's really deadly, it's a really big problem. It's safety aspects of it, but it's actually, CO2 with a little bit of H2S actually lowers your miscibility pressure. So it really depends on miscibility. I mean, there is a nitrogen miscible flood out there too. The miscibility pressure for nitrogen, it's a fairly deep reservoir, it's like 9,000 pounds. So if you can achieve miscibility, the fluid will be good. And the key is it's basically single phase flow at that point. I mean, you always have the water, but rather than have one fluid trying to push the other or having 3 phases out there, you end up with really just the 2 phases. And it looks like primary production. You have constant reservoir pressure because you're keeping the pressure up, and then you just have fluid flow. So, but there are a lot of them that will work. I mean, you can do ethane, you can do propane. I mean, there's people now looking at propane. Quote, it's supposedly cheap right now. But again, it's the hard part is getting the volume that you need to go do it. But you can achieve this with multiple other fluids. Anything else?